Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and today we're on wiring. We're going to start the wiring process. I'm going to take you through some of the products that I'm using. I try to explain why I went the direction I did, sort of kind of give a high level view of what we're going to be doing with this car. Now, a bunch of you have reached out, messaged me, etc., saying that you really want me to show my process, how I wire my cars, any tips or tricks that I can convey that may help you in your build. So I want to take you through some of that, but I'm going to start at really the basics because we're going to think about wiring in a different way. There's sort of the traditional way you might wire a car. And then once you start developing cars, developing chassis, get into racing level or club racing level of wiring with PDMs and that sort of thing, you sort of have to rethink the way that you wire a car for those types of systems. And not just physically, but also sort of mentally, because the systems that we're going to use allow you to do crazy things that while you could do it with physical wiring, would be fantastically complicated to accomplish. And while wiring itself is daunting, adding these extra steps just looks impossible to some. So I want to try and break it down, simplify it, and make it a little easier to tackle for those who are interested. So without further ado, let's get into the basics first. Here we have really the basics as I mentioned. We have our battery, a fuse, a switch, a relay, whatever device we're driving, like a fan, a headlight, or a pump, a ground, and then again back to the battery. Now, normally these arrows will point to sort of the flow of power. So from positive, all these things will be in line. So if we're going to turn on a fan, our fuse is going to be in line already into the relay. The switch is going to turn that relay on, which is then going to send power to our device, like a fan, a headlight, a pump. And then the other side of that is going to go to a ground or a ground source, thus completing the circuit once it comes back to our battery negative. Now, this is about as simple as it gets. So in a traditional wiring setup, this is how you would do it. Most of the simple systems you see, your fuses and your relays will be together in a single box. Your switch would be like your headlight switch on the dash. So that's going to activate your relay, which activates your lights, which goes to your ground, which goes back to your battery. Your lights turn on. Now, where things get interesting is when you start adding more complicated systems like a PDM or an ECU that can control circuits. So looking at a typical system here that would have a ECU or a PDM, systems like these like to switch the ground side. So you'll have battery power, which will go through your high-powered device, or it'll go through your device. Then it'll go to your ECU or PDM, which is then going to switch the ground side to that device, and then completing the circuit going back to our battery negative. Some systems will put a relay on this side, and then the ECU and PDM will control a relay. The fuse here, while it's shown on this diagram, may be optional, and what would normally be the fuse is actually in software on the ECU and PDM. So let's say you have your fan come on and it's drawing too much power. So instead of a normal activation of say an 18 amp draw, maybe there's something caught or there's a malfunction and that fan is suddenly drawing 25 amps. And it's not decreasing. Well, your ECU or your PDM will see that overcurrent, and then it'll turn the switch off, removing the kind of ground activated switch for these high current devices, and thus interrupts the circuit. The device turns off, and that's the end of it. You can have these PDMs try multiple times. So if it tries once, there's too much current draw, it turns it off. It'll wait, say 20 seconds, 30 seconds, however long you program. Then it'll attempt to turn the fan on again automatically. Let's say this time, whatever the problem was, maybe it was a slow to start or something like that, or debris that was caught but is no longer caught in the fan. The fan turns on, it starts at 18 amps, and then it comes back down to 8 amps continuous current, which is below the threshold we set in our ECU or our PDM. Then everything's hunky-dory and it'll just stay on and the circuit will run as it's supposed to. Now that's the sort of more complicated way. Once you start introducing systems like these that have soft power, soft starts, they can limit the amount of current that's pulled when it starts, things like that. It gets more advanced concepts in these type of systems. And furthermore, you can have function logic. Let's say that when you begin staging a car for a drag race, you can set it so that the fuel pump runs at 100%. The fans turn on so that they're running for maximum cooling, and everything's ready to go to run an aggressive run down the drag strip. And then at the end, when you press the brakes, it decreases the fuel pump load to 50%. It keeps the fans on at 100%, and the car enters a cool down mode. And that would all be controlled in functions that you set up in a more advanced PDM. And these functions, I'll say they could be unlimited, but it really depends on which power control device you use, whether it's a Motec, a Haltech, an AIM, any of those. They'll have different limitations for the number or the types of functions you can run and the types of circuits you can control or how you can control them. So now flipping back to our simple circuit, this is how you have to look at everything. It doesn't matter if it has the PDM attached. It doesn't matter how you're driving it, either from the positive side, switching positive or switching negative. The end result is you have a battery, you have a device, you have a way to turn it on and off, and then you have a ground, and that completes your circuit. And once you know this and you know how you're going to be driving your circuit, then all you have to do is tackle one by one. If you're doing one circuit at a time, even if you complete one circuit a day, you will eventually run out of circuits and you'll have wired the car. So I know that's going to be below a lot of you, but I want to get the basics out of the way to explain the different ways we will be wiring the MK. Because of the nature of the beast and the parts we're using, everything can't be digital, and we will have to have some circuits that run the old analog method, driven by a switch or the like. And while those circuits are going to be limited, we still have some. So it's important to cover the basics, but those same basics apply to even the more advanced systems and setup. So with that off the table, let me show you what we're going to be using and a little bit of why I wanted to use it. Okay, we have sort of a hodgepodge mess up here, but we'll get through these systems one by one. So of course, first we have our Nexus PD16. I move the plug there. So this is effectively our fuse box, our relay box, everything all in one. And what's nice is if I spin this out of the way again, for all the circuits, there are activity or status lights for each of the circuits. So if you have this box somewhere you can easily glance at it, you can see if a circuit has a fault without having to pull up a laptop or anything like that. That's kind of a nice feature, and I like that. However, I don't know if this is going to sit in a place that I can make use of it. For our engine, I'm using the Elite 1500. So I can hear some of you guys already, hey Humble, why didn't you use Nexus R3 or R5 when you're already using something that's similar, but it would cost too much? Well, The reason is because I bought the ECU first and I've had it sitting, and rather than just toss this on the shelf, I just bought a PD16 to go with it. So I'm using these two, but if you want to go with an R3 or an R5, that is effectively an Elite ECU and a PDM all in a single box. So you don't have to do it this way. There's an easier way to do it. This is just the way I'm doing it because I had purchased the ECU first early on. To go with both of those, I have a couple of CAN expanders. These are great because they take these male Deutsche plugs and it simply terminates on these CAN expansion units so that you can run multiple devices into this very quickly and easily. And my goal is to have everything tucked up nicely here behind the firewall and under the cowl. So hopefully that will help address some of the wiring mess that there's a lot of potential for. This cute little guy is our wideband controller. We're going to use this because we're going to run a wideband on this motor. It makes tuning a lot easier, and this also works in conjunction with our EGT controller, which is also here. So this guy is our TPMS sensor. What this does is, this is an aftermarket tire pressure monitoring system. And while it's not going to go on these wheels, I have a set of sensors for the next set of wheels. It'll be kind of the street wheels, while these are going to be my track wheels. But this will sit somewhere in the middle of the car, and this is just the main antenna box that talks to all those sensors, so we can monitor our tire pressure and maybe temperature. I'm not sure if this box does that as well, but at least pressure-wise, we'll know where our tires are set and have an early warning if we happen to get a puncture. And last but not least, sir, not appearing in this film is an 8-channel thermistor temperature probe box. We're going to use 4 of those channels for our exhaust. One in each cylinder. Now this is the same thing that I've done on the Ultima, where by having a probe in each cylinder, we can closely monitor air fuel in the cylinder. It's an early indicator if there's a failure or something going wrong before something does go catastrophically wrong. This can be things like a valve not seating correctly, a fuel injector sticking open or closed, anything that's going to drastically change the temperature on one cylinder versus the rest. When you look at those deltas or you look at those differences on a combined map and one of those values is wildly different, you know that there's something going on. And so having those 4 temperature sensors, one for each cylinder, it'll help us tune the car, it'll alert us to any issues down the road. And for something as highly tuned and highly strung as this, any additional protection you can get will just work better in your favor in the long run. So that's why I wanted to go with that. So we have all of our boxes. They're going to be sitting up here somewhere. We're going to try and run our wiring down into the tunnel. Wiring for the engine is going to be coming forward. And my goal here is to keep all of our sensor wiring in the engine bay. That seems like it would be obvious, but this applies to things that could optionally be in the rear and away from the engine. For example, a fuel pressure and temperature sensor. I'm going to run that on the fuel rail. I could run it in the back off of the fuel pressure regulator, and I may still, I haven't quite decided yet, if I keep it back on the fuel pressure regulator and I'm running a returnless system, it's not really going to reflect the true temperature of the fuel, depending on flow rate, etc., etc. But if there's stagnant fuel in the rail, if you know there's a temperature difference up here from running in the engine bay, having the temp sensor on the fuel in the back isn't necessarily going to reflect the difference. I realize that difference may only be a couple of degrees Fahrenheit. Still, I want to try and have the most accurate data that I can. The danger is that by having that sensor up here on the fuel rail, it could be damaged by the vibrations of this engine. And so that's an argument for running it in the back. So I haven't decided yet, but that's one thing that I'm still considering. All the other sensors, we are running a map sensor. There's a reason why, and I'll get to that later, but even with ITBs, you do want to try and run like a log manifold and a common vacuum reservoir. It does help with the tuning. It depends on your ECU, but it does help with the tuning. So I am going to try to run that. All the pressure and temperature sensors for water, oil, and fuel, as I mentioned before. Everything else that you'll need for a VTEC engine. So our cam sensors, our crank angle sensor, our VTEC position, our VTEC control solenoids, all that stuff. All of those things are going to be forward here in the engine bay. And then our main harness. So taking a look at these, so this is going to be our main engine harness. A lot of people will look at this and just be intimidated by this huge bundle of wires. But if we look, without throwing this everywhere, we're not using all of these wires, and there's what, maybe 34-ish in this bundle. So if you look at this and you do one circuit a day, just little by little, and you start peeling it off, well, eventually you're just gonna run out of wires. And that's how you have to look at it, is don't be intimidated by the big picture. Just focus on the little thing and do one job, complete one circuit. And that's it. That's all you have to do is just do one at a time. You figure it out. It's not hard to understand. As I demonstrated on those diagrams earlier, you have a power source, you have a power drain, you have a switch or a relay or some way to control that circuit. So you just need to follow the arrows from one piece to the next until you've completed your circuit, and then lather and rinse, repeat for the rest of them. This is going to be our main ECU bundle harness. And then this one down here is for the rest of the car. So this is for things like our, turn signals, brake lights, the whole rest of the car, fuel pump, radiator fan, some of the like power to the injectors, power for the coils. All that comes off of this harness. So some of that's going to come forward through the car, and some of that's going to go backward to the back of the car. And again, just like the engine harness, one circuit at a time. Once you start going through this, there's only, 30 or so wires, 40 wires, whatever it is. But if you complete one of these a day and you go through both harnesses, even if you did just one a day, you could have your whole car completely wired within 2 months. Now that sounds like a lot, but I know projects like this that have gone on for 5 to 10 years because of the daunting nature of this picture. When you zoom out and then you realize, like, oh God, there's all these things and I have all these wires and I don't know where to start and what do I do? It's easy to fall into this kind of despair or this kind of decision paralyzation, whether it's the fear of making something permanent, the fear of the unknown, you don't know where to start, or you're afraid of starting in the wrong place. Don't be. You can always go back. None of this stuff is permanent. Like, it's kind of weird to think, but you're building a car from not quite scratch, but it's a kit. Like, you're putting it together. If you do something wrong, well, you just go and correct it. It's a little extra time, but no one's the wiser. It's not like this. You're putting this on YouTube for everyone to see your mistakes. You can keep those mistakes to yourself. That's all optional. Just by starting one circuit at a time, it's easy to get through. One of my favorite sayings is, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. Eventually, you're going to run out of elephant. And that's kind of how you have to look at these, is your biggest issue is starting, but once you've started, you just keep going until you're done. So with that look at wiring, there's still yet more, but I really wanted to give just a high level. There's a couple things that I haven't mentioned yet. I think I may have mentioned them earlier. So there's the IC7 dash, which I plan to use. That's going to be our display and replace all of our gauges with the exception of one. And that's going to be this guy. So this is a Gauge Art can gauge, which in conjunction with the IC7 can read more data off of your CAN bus. You can set the different channels. I plan to use it as a dedicated fuel gauge, but also read some more information at a glance, because I can also get my TPMS data on there. I can get any variety of things, but mostly I plan to use it as a dedicated fuel gauge. I mentioned previously that I did plan to use a whole gauge set and changed my mind. Well, this was part of that original idea, but I'm still fond of using this, so I plan to. I know there's not a lot of work here, and this is kind of more of a primer to get us started in wiring, to talk about the different systems that I want to use, to sort of set the idea of how we're going to tackle this kind of large project. For all the rest of the car, bolting on the wheels, bolting on the suspension, putting in the engine and trans, all of those things I would say are half of a build, and then wiring is its own other half. A lot of manufacturers now, like MK, like GBS, like even Ultima, all these cars, their biggest strives forward is simplifying this wiring. Now the MK, as a kit, they do supply a totally plug-and-play harness, and they're trying to make that as easy as possible for a drop-in setup. So if you're running a Miata engine, Miata transmission, all the Miata bits, they have a harness for you that's ready to go and needs almost zero work. It's just a literally plug-and-play solution, and I applaud that fact. If you're running that type of a kit, if you're building that type of a base car and you're intimidated by wiring, there is no shame in using an off-the-shelf harness. And in fact, you know, I strongly recommend doing that, because you can start driving your car sooner. You can enjoy it sooner, and you're not going to be held up by that paralyzation that I talked about earlier. So go ahead and use that harness. It's fantastic. It's great. However, this is a bespoke build, so we're going to tackle these things one by one, and I'm going to explain all my choices as we go through them. Well, that being said, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was at least a little bit informative, and if you have more questions, go ahead and put them in the comments down below. I'll try to answer them as I get around to the next series of videos with wiring, and do my best to show you as I go along. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.